Hello all you beautiful people, welcome to my Nova Imperator guide. This guide was a 50 sub goal on my Twitch stream, so I'm going to make it as in-depth as possible to thank all the people who support me. Also note, I may make small mentions to PvP, but this is more so a PvE guide, since I just play PvP casually. This guide is split into multiple sections to make it more comprehensive. Part 1 will be an introduction to Nova, briefing people on what they should expect while attempting to play him. Part 2 will be going over all his skills and passives, explain how to use each of them effectively, and how to get the most damage out of them. Part 3 will explain how to build a Nova, going over what type of gear to give him, how to socket him, etc. Part 4 will be practical application of Nova, giving examples of Nova gameplay in late game dungeons and explaining what roles he plays in each of the important dungeons in the game, like SD, Riggamore, Master Road, Pruinam, raids, etc. Part 5 will be the conclusion, wrapping up the positives and negatives about playing Nova, and my personal experience from maining him ever since he came to NA. Nova Imperator is a high-risk character with devastating big bossing capabilities and excellent mana management, and recently he got some solid supporting capabilities as well. Nova has the unique Overheat system. By mashing a skill button, Nova can burn some of his HP and modify his skill, usually giving it more damage or hits to each of his skills and activating his passives. In 99.9% of situations, you should overheat every single skill you use. This is the #1 thing that makes Nova, Nova. However, Nova can be quite slow in comparison to other classes in terms of skill casting, but with skill positioning, just one of his best skills like Rain of Fire can be one of the strongest big bossing tools. In terms of clearing, NI can get the job done with minimal potion usage, but he is nowhere close to the fastest characters. Furthermore, Nova can support through MP buffs, clunky super armor, and debuffs. Nova is definitely not the character that is perfect for every situation, but he is very fun to play and very solid overall. First, I will talk about skills in priority of how important they are, and give a brief description on them and what traits to take for them. Giga Prominence and Rain of Fire are Nova's two best bossing skills, and should both have the heavy trait. Giga and Rain both have amazing damage output, but need to be positioned well in order to get most out of their damage. It's the easiest to do against big bosses, but Giga in particular can be used to do very nice damage to small bosses as well. Here's a quick tip, if you stand really close to the enemy and use 7 burst, you can go straight into Giga and have 3 pillars connect. In terms of what skill to stack, you can do full Giga or half Giga and half Rain. I would not recommend full stacking Rain, as most important bosses are small bosses. Bursting Blade is Nova's main buffing skill and should only be taken modded with the useful trait. This skill slaps a nice 10% crit damage increase on everything, and the only downside is that unfortunately only lasts 10 seconds, so you'll have to be spamming it constantly, but at least the damage is solid too. Revolver Cannon is one of Nova's fastest good damage skills, and you can have either the heavy or critical trait. This is a skill you can just quickly fire out whenever you want. When figuring out the trait for NI, it mostly depends on what you want to do with him. If you play in mostly low-level combat power dungeons, like SD or Midair, you might want to choose heavy. If you're doing more late-game dungeons, like Riggamore, Rosso, and Birth Raids, critical will be better to shred defenses. You also have the choice between modded or unmodded. Modded has a splash hit and does more initial damage, but unmodded has piercing, so it can be better for things like Midair clearing, but most of the times you do want to take modded. Ignition Crow Napalm, or as I like to call it, Floor Crow, is one of Nova's supporting skills, activating super armor inside the flames, and should be taken traitless. This skill takes a bit of knack to aim, as the super armor only activates while inside the flame. A personal good tip is to activate Floor Crow right after a revolver or 7 burst, as those skills push Nova slightly backwards. Also note that this will activate his Flames of Victory passive. Ignition Crow Incineration, or as I like to call it, Air Crow, is Nova's best clearing skill and should have the critical trait. This skill has a very solid hitbox, decent damage, and a splash damage hit. It is not the best clearing skill in the world in comparison with other characters, but it's the best tool Nova has to get the job done. Also note, this is the other skill that activates the Flames of Victory passive. 7 Burst is Nova's best base skill for damage. It is decently fast, has solid damage, and should be taken with a useful trait. 7 Burst is mostly a filler skill for when your stronger skills are on cooldown. It can also be a solid setup for Ignition Crow Napalm super armor. Harpoon Spear is a solid filler skill. It's fast, has good damage, and should have the heavy trait. One thing to remember about Harpoon is you need to jump before you use it. Also, the modded version has some niche usage, but nothing important to mention here. Ifrit Flame is another one of Nova's supporting skills. It reduces enemy elemental resistance and defense, and is normally taken with the Killing Blow trait. Very recently, this skill got buffed and is now a generally solid clearing skill, bolstering splash damage, so it could also be worth it to take the heavy trait, but I personally have not tested that yet. Shadow Step is a very versatile base Raven skill, used mostly for positioning and movement. This skill should have the Haste trait. So those are all the main skills you will be using, but now let me talk about the leftovers. Deadly Raid has very long iframes, decent damage, however it is just an extremely slow skill. Deadly Raid is pretty nice to use early on, we're just trying to stay alive as Nova, and it stacks his Master of Warfare passive 3 times in one skill, but it just gets outclassed. I personally take the regenerating trait, but maybe you can take the critical trait if you want to try it, it's up to you. Hellfire Gatling is okay damage wise, but is also a very slow skill. If you pair Hellfire Gatling up with Deadly Raid, you can achieve infinite iframes, which can be very good early on in the game. But as you get towards Roster Raid, Master Road, etc., those iframes are just gonna kill you. If you do want to use it, take the Empowered trait.
Flamesword is a decent little active skill if you want to use one and should have the powerful trait. And if you use the very niche Oath of Ruin build, it's how you will proc it. It's also decent for PvP for its super armor trait. Power Assault is just a strength skill that can be used to move bosses and Midair for positioning. If you want to take it, take the heavy trait. Cannon Blade is a simple damage skill that is outclassed by other skill. You can take either useful or the heavy trait. Haze Explosion, Mental Crash, Mod Breaking Fist, Shooting Dash, Napalm Grenade, and Hellfire each have their own uses in PvP and should have the Persistent, Killing Blow, Light, Regenerating, Haste, and useful traits respectively. And Emergency Boost is your typical escape skill. Maximum Cannon, Ground Impact, and Flamesword Flurry have no notable uses. Nova's Hypers Burning Buster and Into the Hell are both very weak in PvE, but they can both be stored for room transitions, so they can be used for Midair speedruns. Nova's Masterclass skill Giga Blaster has no real uses, but if every skill you have is on cooldown, it can be some decent damage. And that's all the skills. Again, at all times possible, you should be overheating every single one of these skills. Now, let's move on to the passives. Mercenary Behavior stops you from taking overheat damage at 50% HP and gives you magical attack when you awaken, so make sure you are always in awakening on Nova. Victory Survival Strategy lets you use Flame Sword and Haze Explosion midair and reduces certain debuff durations. It also lets you overheat with just 2% HP. Veteran is the main buff that you want to upkeep. It activates at 50% or lower HP, gives you 18% more attack power, and lasts 10 seconds. Quick tip by the way, that 10-second timer only starts counting down when you are above 50% HP, so if you are high HP from healers or potions, you have plenty of time to get back to 50% HP. Mercenary Survival Strategy gives you 15% defense and elemental resistance when under 50% HP, giving him a bit of tankiness. Overheat Mode activated increases the power of your overheat buff. With this passive you can have 2 overheat buffs, each increasing your damage by 7.3 for each buff. Awaken Will gives you 8% attack power and 20% maximize when you have the overheat buff active, meaning you can sock it a lot less maximized thankfully. Flames of Victory gives you 33% special active cooldown when you activate either Air Crow or Floor Crow, with a reactivation cooldown of 7 seconds. The best part with this passive is that the cooldown reduction is taken from the maximum cooldown of the skill, not the current cooldown, so you mostly want to use your crows after your best skills are on cooldown. Last Resort is Nova's Resurrection passive. This passive consumes Nova's core and gives him a resurrection and heals him for 20% HP over 10 seconds. It also has a reactivation cooldown of 90 seconds. This passive may feel inconsistent since it needs core to be active when Nova dies, but it can still save you in a lot of situations. Nova's final passive is Master of Warfare, an MP and crit passive that stacks up to 5 times with consecutive overheats and one of his best supporting passives. This passive turns Nova into an MP machine and makes most of your potions irrelevant. This passive is split up into 2 buffs with bonus effects when proccing one of them. I will call the buffs Heat Detection and Max Stack respectively. When you activate Overheat, you gain 1 Heat Detection stack, which each stack giving you 5% critical. Heat Detection has a 20-second duration and no reactivation cooldown. Once stacked up 5 times, Max Stack buff is activated and you will gain a permanent 20 MP per second and 10% crit damage increase. Max Stack has a 10-second duration and a reactivation cooldown of 5 seconds. The bonus effect is, once Max Stack is activated, you and all your allies will get a burst of flat 200 MP. And the best part about that is that the burst has infinite range. If you activate it, your party will get the MP no matter what. With all that in mind, what does this add up to? Once you gain the full passive and you are overheating once every 5 seconds, you will have a permanent 25% critical, 10% crit damage increase, 20 MP per second, and a constant 200 MP burst every 5 seconds. If overheating was the reason you picked up Nova, this is the passive that will make you want to stay. It is very fun to use, can take the burden off of socketing, and lets you be an MP battery for your party. And those are all the Nova skills. They all revolve around buffing yourself up with Master of Warfare and Bursting Blade, and then letting your 300 MPs tear bosses apart. Just make sure you're overheating every single skill. Nova mostly has the typical things you would want for a magical class. At early game, you want blue area node, DSOI, SD accessory set. At end game, you should have
Crimson Rigamore, 3 pieces of Master Road, Exodia, Bravery Erudite Ring, whatever costume you can get, or of course, whatever Iceburner is meta if you can. Nothing really out of the ordinary there. The one unique thing about Nova is that he prefers Variance Fur to a Gate if you are aiming for more damage, since his best skills do not have Defense Ignore, but that's mostly a min-maxing thing. In terms of stat building, you can stock it just around 70% critical and 73% maximized with plus 11 Rigamore. At lower gears, you can get away with around 73% critical and 75% maximized. You should also try to get as close as possible to 125% action speed. I'm only at 123 and I'm still doing pretty good. For synergies, I typically use Demon, half Third Path, and Time and Space. If you want a more safe build, you can do Fine Cause It Hurts, half Third Path, and Time and Space. But if you want to be more support-oriented, you can do full Third Path for the Seal of Time synergy. In terms of builds, there are 2 extremely niche builds away from the standard build. Firstly, there's the Indom build, a build that used to be popular when Rasa was meta, but I highly do not recommend this build. I won't go into big details in this video, but in the current Elsword meta, the downsides unfortunately outweigh the upsides with this build, and even if I personally attempt to use this build with my current stats, it would only give me around 15% more boss damage, and that's if nothing goes wrong. There's also a neat Oath of Ruin build that I have personally been trying out. It revolves around using the title button to switch from DPS title to Oath of Ruin, proccing it with Flame Sword, and then back to your DPS title. But only doing that when Giga and Rain are about to be off cooldown. Because your party has very good cooldown reducers, it's not worth it to use the time to switch titles. It's a cute technique, but pretty hard to execute consistently. I should quickly mention the total iframe build. It focuses on spamming Deadly Raid, Revolver, and Hellfire Gatling. Chaining all these skills together gives you almost 100% iframes, and once you fully stack Master of Warfare, the MP he gets funds the build itself. This build is useless once you get to bosses that ignore iframes, like Master Road and Birth, but if you want to use a weaker Nova for Haner weeklies, it's fantastic for that. And that's how you build Nova. All things considered, there's not much out of the ordinary here, and he's pretty standard to build. So first off, let's list the best and worst places Nova can perform at both high gear and low gear. Nova can SD farm okay, but is not the best at both gear levels. Nova is very good at farming Fusion Theory at any gear level, and because of his good bossing and MP passive, he doesn't need many potions to grind it. Nova is absolutely fantastic in Haner and is one of his best modes. At low gear, you can use his amazing iframes and fantastic MP to complete both normal and challenge with ease. If you have a Nova, you should always use him to clear Haner every single week. Nova is not the best EXP or drop farm, but if you like saving your potions and grinding, he can be a niche option for you. For Rasa Raid, when you have good gear, he is a very fantastic DPS there. There's plenty of big bosses which can be absolutely dominated by Rain and Giga, and even the small bosses can take very good damage from Giga when positioned well. Remember, if you 7 burst straight on the boss and then Giga, you can get 3 pillars off. Now if you don't have the best gear, you can still support decently in Rasa Raid. If your flame reduces elemental resistance and defense, Floor Crow can give decent super armor if you focus on placing it, and of course, Master of Warfare is the amazing MP battery for the whole team. Nova is not as crucial as a healer or a tank, but he is a great secondary support. Bossing is Nova's forte, so he is fantastic in Master Roads, especially Adrian and Hernia, since those bosses are quite large. Now for Birth Raid, it's a little bit harder for Nova to work in. He lacks Defense Ignore, so he can't keep up with similar gear DPS that do have Defense Ignore, and staying alive can potentially be difficult without other classes like CC or Celestia giving Nova more tankiness. At the same time, there's a decent amount of big bosses in there, and his support is pretty solid in there too. So overall, not the best, but not the worst. Now gameplay wise, I want to make sure Bursting Blade is always on. If the boss is weaker like the first fight at Crimson Tower, and you attack fast like the first fight at Crimson Cradle, you can go straight for Rain and or Giga. If not, build up Master of Warfare with 5 overheatable skills, and then keep rotating using your crows to reset your cooldown, and keeping using up your 300 MPs whenever possible. But try out different rotations if you want, keeping Giga as your main priority, and see what works for you. Be creative, you know? So in conclusion, Nova is fantastic against big bosses, decent versus small bosses, has some pretty solid support, and is okay at clearing. He needs to worry about his slow cast times, so having speed buffers can help a lot. Nova is pretty easy to play, but hard to master. Positioning is a big thing on him, making sure all your Giga Pillars and Rain of Fire fireballs are hitting the boss. Along with being comfortable and managing a character with constantly lower HP, Nova can seem a bit intimidating, but he's extremely fun to play.
It should also be mentioned that Nova is a really cool character, both design and personality-wise. Speaking of looks, he is also objectively very attractive looking character. While this does not necessarily affect gameplay, it is regardless something very important to mention, as looks and personality can potentially make or break what characters you want to play, but do not worry, as Nova fits this criteria perfectly. The main draws to Nova, and the reason I was drawn to him, is because he gives up HP for damage. Being in that state kind of reminded me of things like critical moding in the Kingdom Hearts series, so if you like challenges like that in video games when you're low HP and you're trying to do a lot of damage, Nova is going to be right up your league. Along with that, being an MP machine is just straight up super fun to play, and you can help your teammates in almost any type of content. The Overheat system is also very simple to understand and really fun to just go to town with. So go ahead, make a Nova Imperator today, start overheating, gaining MP, and dominating big bosses today. Have yourselves a fantastic day, and thank you so much for watching.